The Wicker Man is a 1973 folk horror film starring the late great Edward Woodward and Christopher Lee about a devoutly religious English copper visiting a rural neo-pagan Scottish community in search of a missing girl whose whereabouts seem to be a secret to no one except for Sergeant Howie, Woodward's character. If you haven't seen the film before, I'd highly recommend checking it out, as it's one of maybe 2 or 3 genuinely unnerving movies I've ever watched. And hey, Christopher Lee gave this movie somewhat of a pedigree by stating that it was his best film. Which, I mean, come on, this is Christopher Lee we're talking about here. He was basically the Rock of the 60s and 70s, except he usually didn't star in dog shit and was always the most compelling actor on screen at any given time. Usually. My feelings on the film aside, as evidenced by the title, the film centers around the theme of human sacrifice in the Celtic tradition. And it does not shy away from the more unnerving aspects of the culture, especially evident when a whole tavern starts singing a song about how much they like banging the innkeeper's daughter, all while the dude is standing right there and has this wide, ominous smile which suggests that he's been hitting it too. It's really fucking weird, man. However, it should be pointed out that this film claims to have been supported by the real Lord Summerisle and the people of West Coast Scotland, and thanks them for their privileged insight into their religious practices. Except, no, it wasn't. Summerisle and its residents don't actually exist. The screenplay was lifted from another screenplay, which was adapted into a novel before being adopted into yet another screenplay which only tangentially resembled the novel, and the mythological aspects of the story were lifted from the classic yet horribly outdated and erroneous Golden Bough. However, this is not what we are here for today. Wrong channel. Instead, I want to critically examine the historical evidence suggesting what many today consider to be an absolute truth: that pagan Celts really did practice human sacrifice for their religious rituals. Based off of scant writings we have on the Wicker Man, and the bodies fished out of the peaty bogs of northern Europe beginning in the 20th century, this may provide us with the most plentiful and legitimate evidence yet. All that and more in today's episode of Messiahs and History. Hello ladies and gentlemen of the internet, Messiah here. Before we get started with today's video, I just want to remind you all that this is, in fact, the first video ever on this channel. So, if you'd like to see more of this type of content, please let me know with a like, comment, share, and of course subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all of my new videos. And I'm sure most of you have already migrated from there, but if you just happen to find this video by chance, I also have a main channel specializing in world mythologies called Messiahs and Mythology. So be sure to check that out as well if you are interested. Alright, so let's get the more obvious one out of the way first. The Wicker Man is almost certainly, in my opinion, a work of historical fiction based primarily on Roman propaganda. I realize that this is a legitimate event which is carried out by frat boys at the end of spring break who should not be within a square mile of a box of matches after a weekend of near-fatal inebriation, but hey, at least they aren't burning anyone alive in there to appease some sort of fertility deity. Because let's be fair here, spring break Miami is about as godless as what happened in the parking lot of an Applebee's in downtown Cleveland in 2006. Don't look too much into that one. The first mention of a Wicker Man, so far as I or anyone else has been able to find, is in the writings of Julius Caesar himself, who was actively waging war against the Gauls at the time, and it could be reasonably assumed that while in the process of trying to fish Vercingetorix out of Alesia, he was already thinking of new ways to justify his unsanctioned and illegal conquest to the people of Rome back home. And that, boys and girls, is, supposedly, why we eventually got Commentari del Bello Gallicio, or Gaelic war, if you want to be boring about it. And this specific line written in Book 6, Chapter 16. All the people of Gaul are completely devoted to religion, and for this reason those who are greatly affected by diseases and the dangers of battle either sacrifice human victims or vow to do so using the Druids as administrators to these sacrifices, since it is judged that unless for a man's life is given back, the will of the immortal gods cannot be placated. In public affairs, they have instituted the same kind of sacrifice. Others have effigies of great size interwoven with twigs, the limbs of which are filled up with living people which are set on fire from below. The people are deprived of life, surrounded by flames. It is judged that the punishment of those who participated in theft or brigandage or other crimes are more pleasing to the immortal gods. But when the supplies of this kind fail, they even go so low as to inflict punishment on the innocent. Later on, the Greek historian Strabo, upon the commission of Cicero and tutelage of Tyrannian, wrote of the fellow historian Poseidonus, "In addition to their folly, they have a barbarous and absurd custom, common, however, with many nations of the north, of suspending the heads of their enemies from their horses' necks on return from battle, and when they have arrived, nailing them as a spectacle to their gates." Poseidonus says that he witnessed this in many different places, and was at first shocked, but became familiar with it in time on account of its frequency. The heads of any illustrious person they embalm with cedar, exhibit them to strangers, and would not sell them for their weight in gold. However, the Romans put a stop to these customs, as well as their modes of sacrifice and divination, which were quite opposite to those sanctioned by our laws. They would strike a man devoted as an offering in the back with his sword, and divine from his convulsive throes. Without the Druids, they never sacrifice. It is said they have other modes of sacrificing their human victims, that they pierce some of them with arrows and crucify others in their temples, and that they would prepare a colossus of hay and wood, into which they put cattle, beasts of all kinds, and men, and then set fire to it. Pretty gruesome stuff. However, I'd like to postulate that the writings of Strabo are in fact a second-hand account of another historian who would have been quite familiar with the rumors of human sacrifice by Wicker Man, stated by Caesar as indisputable fact. Despite this, no further physical evidence has ever come out denoting the practice of using a Wicker Man for human sacrifice, so X to doubt on that one. However, in the spirit of fairness, let's also consider some of the other things Strabo says here, as they're not necessarily incredible, but rather unlikely. They pierce some of them with arrows is a bit odd, as the Celts did have bows and arrows, but they actually weren't commonly used, as killing from afar in their culture was seen as cowardly. And it doesn't make sense to line up a bunch of sacrifice with their wrists bound and just shoot them from afar like a firing squad. They are also supposed to be blood sacrifices to their gods, yet in this case there is a suspicious lack of bloodletting. There's also the line ordaining that they crucify others in their temples. Now, crucifixion has been around since the time of the Mesopotamians, and was practiced in a wide variety of peoples prior to that crucifixion, including, but not limited to, the Persians, Carthaginians, Macedonians, and of course, the Romans. However, given the relative cultural isolationism of the Celtic Druids and a lack of supporting evidence if they did indeed practice ritualistic human sacrifice via the crucifixion, they would have learned it from the Romans. That aside, if we take crucifixion literally here, that would mean that the Celts would have had to have cut down some of their precious trees in order to make such devices, which, if you know anything about the spiritual nature of the Celts, you'd realize is a big no-no, because that is an affront to the very same gods they would be trying to please by whacking some dude. But the most damning statement of all is one which Strabo absolutely could have gotten away with not mentioning. That they do this sort of thing in their temples. The Druids were a very secretive bunch, and while we don't know much about them or the continental Celts in general, it is generally agreed upon that all of their religious ceremonies took place outside, and with possible exception of sites like Stonehenge, there is no evidence that the Druids ever had enclosed temples constructed to perform religious rites in, much less human sacrifices, depending on how literally you want to interpret Strabo's words here. Arrows could really refer to pikes used for impalement or the like. Temples, like those found in Yorkshire, do exist, though are incredibly rare, and crucifixion could just be slamming a couple of nails into a guy until he bleeds out. But that's kind of reaching. Also, not everything said here is entirely incorrect. The Celts actually did take the heads of their enemies and embalm them as war trophies, as evidenced by the discovery of human skulls positioned in public quarters of the Les Calais site in southern France. That being said, there is still no real evidence of Wicker Men being used for sacrificial rites, and unless I somehow build a time machine, hopelessly try to get myself recruited into Caesar's 1st century Roman legion, despite the fact I'd stand out like a sore thumb, being 6 foot and pale as fuck, all for the chance to maybe see some poor schmuck getting roasted inside a giant effigy of a man, I'm gonna have to agree with the academic consensus on this one and say that this was all the work of Roman propaganda. What cannot be discounted, at least so easily, however, is the actual physical evidence. So, forensics is one of my favorite fields of science, primarily because it can be explained without math. Primarily, I love puzzles and an end goal in mind. So the claim of human sacrifice postulated by the Romans was largely discredited all the way up until 1938 with the discovery of the Elling woman, the less famous counterpart of the Tulland Man, who was similarly found to have been hung, her body dumped in the bogs of Denmark around the 5th century BC. Elling woman was a lot worse for wear when compared to Tulland Man, though what we have been able to tell is that there was a suspicious lack of organs in her body despite the fact that she had been wrapped in sheepskin right after her death. Remember this, I'm gonna come back to it later. By contrast, Tulland Man is easily the best preserved mummy, ever. To the point where we can tell that this guy hadn't shaved the day of his death due to a slight stubble in his chin. Likewise, examinations into Tulliman's stomach show us that not only had his organs not been disturbed, but his last meal hadn't even been fully digested yet. Okay, Messiah, you might be saying to yourself. 2 people presumably killed as a form of capital punishment during the Iron Age had their corpses dumped into a bog somewhere in Denmark. What's the big deal? The big deal is, these aren't the only naturally mummified remains found in northern European bogs. Far from it. In fact, the Elling woman wasn't even the first discovered bog body, just the most well-preserved found at that time. There are hundreds of partial remains which have been surfaced from the bogs, from Denmark to Germany and Poland, all the way up to England, with many of these bodies showing signs of strangulation, either by a noose as demonstrated in a Tulland Man, or via some form of woven cloth. However, some of the deaths were far more brutal. Take, for example, Lindo Man, a body which was found to have been strangled, beaten over the head thrice, stabbed in the chest for good measure, and then had his throat cut, possibly to signify ritualistic bloodletting. Similarly, the Cloney Caven Man and Old Krogan Man show similar signs of a violent death, as both victims were found to be disemboweled, with both bodies even missing their waists and legs. Though in the case of Cloney Caveman, this is believed to be a result of the excavation machine being used in the bog at the time of his discovery. However, even more interestingly, both men were determined of being of high status due to their manicured nails, fancy hair gels, and evidence of a meat-rich diet. So it's often thought that it is no coincidence that both men's nipples were missing, indicating that they had been sliced off post-mortem, leading some to believe that this was done by a disgruntled populace disposing of an ineffective ruler. And why is that? Well, it's believed that the kings of ancient Ireland were ceremoniously married to their fertility goddess at the time of their coronation. and it's thought that those subjects of the king were to show their subservience by suckling on the king's nipples. Cutting these off would be a last major sign of disrespect, while also thematically cutting off the relationship the king supposedly had to the fertility goddess. Ancient Ireland was fucking crazy! So, what do these bog bodies actually mean? Jack shit. Look, I'd like to sit here and tell you that all these murder victims we found over the years are conclusive evidence that there were some shenanigans going on supporting the idea that the Celts were the monstrous pot-smoking baby eaters the Romans want you to believe that they were, but let's take a moment to really consider where they were found. In a bog. That is to say, they were thrown down there while the region was mostly still covered in lake water. And how many times have you heard stories of serial killers dumping their victims into a lake so no one will ever find them? It's not exactly creative. In fact, a lot of these bodies show signs of murder which were found with sticks or some form of weight on top of them, suggesting someone really wanted to flush them down there and keep them from coming back up. But Messiah! I hear one of you typing in the comments like you're some sort of high IQ'd Giga Chad about to ruin my whole damn channel, but really you're just some insecure low-tier Reddit garbage. What about all the strangulations? They can't merely be a coincidence. Actually, yeah, it can. Back in those days, people could really only afford one knife, and that was used for cooking. So if you're a bit strapped for cash and don't have access to a sword or an axe or a bow and arrow, your best bet to settle a feud is to come up behind the guy and choke him out with whatever you have available to you. The fact that there really isn't a consistent method of killing employed on these remains seems to suggest that these people weren't killed ritualistically, as you'd think the druids would have come up with a more consistent way to let out blood and appease their gods. So, at risk of sounding like a high school boy trying to reach a word count for a term paper, in conclusion, I personally don't see any significant evidence to suggest human sacrifice among the Celts, and those who are proponents of the idea are likely trying to construct a fantasy to make history more sensational than it really needs to be. Thank you all so very much for watching my very first video on this new channel. Showing your support with a like and subscription would be really appreciated, and will show me that you guys would like to see more of this sort of content. So, I'll continue making it. If any of you have a historical topic you'd like to see me do in the future, let me know in the comments down below, and I might eventually get around to it. But until then, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, my name is Messiahs in History, and go and make some history happen today.